All right, let's talk about example 4. So the last theorem in this section is one of my favorites. It's called the third angles theorem. This one's so fun. Okay, so what this one says is if two angles of one triangle are congruent. Okay, so let's look at what that means. So if you see here, there's two triangles and there's these arc marks, right? So what we have is we have one angle. This angle is congruent to this angle, right? And then this angle here of the triangle is congruent to this angle here. So what the third angles theorem says is if two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle. So here we have these two angles of this triangle which are congruent to these two angles of the other triangle. Then what it says, the third pair of angles are then congruent. So that means this angle and this angle are congruent because of the third angles theorem. So angle N is congruent to angle T. Okay, let's see if this makes sense. Let's just put some numbers on here, and I just want to keep it like super easy. So what would be super easy? Let's say we call this one, let's call this one 80, okay? I'm going to do a different color, okay. So let's call this one 80. Let's see if this makes sense. So if this one's 80 and this one's 80, and I'm just making numbers, right? And then this one is, let's just call this one 40, right? This one's 40 degrees, then this one would have to be 40 degrees, right? And then by the triangle sum theorem, what, 80, they all add up to 180 degrees. So if this was 80 plus 40, that would be 120, 180 minus 120, which would mean this one would have to be 60 degrees. And the same is true here, right? Triangle sum theorem, all of these add up to 180. So 40 plus 80 is 120, and 180 minus 120 would be 60. And so you can see they actually end up being the same amount. So that means that N and T are congruent by the third angles theorem. Perfect. Okay, let's look at this example. Ooh, this is kind of fun. We have these two triangles and they overlap. What we need to do is we need to find the measure of angle K. All right, which is right there. So it says measure of angle K is 4y squared. And then we also need to find the measure of angle J, which is right here, 6y minus 40. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and write down that given information. So let's change up the color. Measure of angle K is equal to 4y squared. And measure of angle J is equal to 6y squared minus 40, and that is given. Okay, so what do we see? We have these two triangles, and then we have this, you know, we could even say that's an itty-bitty triangle, but I really think we're just going to be talking about the big triangles. And what do we see? Oh, this angle of this triangle and this angle of this triangle are the same. Okay. So we have these ones are the same, right? And then we have two arc marks here and here. So that means that these two angles are the same. So if we have two sets of angles that are congruent, therefore these have to be congruent by the third angles theorem. So we're going to say that angle K is congruent to angle J by the third angles theorem. Okay, then we want to substitute stuff in, right? But we can't substitute it in with this congruent symbol, so we have to change it to the measure of angle K equals the measure of angle J. That is done by the definition of congruent angles. Then we just substitute in, right? So 4y squared equals measure of angle J, 6y squared minus 40. Okay, and what's that, substitution? And then we just need to figure out what y is. So I'm going to get the y's on the same side. I think usually I move the smaller one, right? But since what, Joy? Yeah, since this one is over here by itself, I'm going to move the 6y over. So subtract 6y squared to both sides. Subtraction, property of equality. We end up with negative 2y squared equals negative 40. What do we do? Just simplify. And then we want to get y squared by itself. So we're going to divide both sides by negative 2. Negative and a negative become a positive. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we end up with y squared equals a negative divided by negative is a positive. 40 divided by 2 is 20. So what was that? Division property of equality. And simplify. Perfect. Okay. So this is something to pay attention to, right? So usually when we're doing this, we want to figure out what y is. So at this point, we would square root both sides and determine what y is, right? However, if you look at it, we're trying to find measure of angle K and measure of angle J, and both of these are in y squared. Do you see it's 4y squared, and this is 6y squared minus 40? So if it was like 4y, then we want to get y by itself, or if this was 6y minus 40 and it didn't have the squared, then we would, we obviously have to figure out what y is. But since it's in terms of y squared, we're good right here. Like, we don't have to determine what y is. We're okay just knowing what y squared is. And let me show you. So if we figure out what that first one is, I'm going to change color. Let's go light blue. So, right, we had measure of angle K is equal to 4y squared. And so we just substitute 20 in for y squared because y squared is equal to 20. So 4 times 20, isn't that so nice? Because we know what y squared is 20, we just substituted in. So what was this? This was given, and then 9 was substitution. So this was 8, 9, and then just simplify and we get measure of angle K equals 80, right? So that's simplify. And then we already stated up here that measure of angle K and measure of angle J are the same. So if we say measure of angle J is equal to 80 as well, that would be the transitive property of equality. Because they're the same. Perfect. So that is it. That is example 4. That's how you apply that third angles theorem. Remember, if you have two sets of angles which are the same, that third angle is congruent. I love this theorem so much. Okay, let's move on to the next problem. Check it out, example 4. And this is your turn to show off your wonderful, magnificent skills. So we have these two triangles here. So here's my friend the pause dragon. Remind you to pause your device. Go ahead and work it out. When you get done, press play, and we'll go over it. All right, let's see how you did. So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to find the measure of angle P and the measure of angle T. So if you look here, the measure of angle P is 2x squared, and the measure of angle T is 4x squared minus 32. Okay, cool. Let's look at this problem first. I guess maybe we should define our terms, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go with 0. Okay, so measure of angle P is equal to 2x squared, and the measure of angle T is equal to 4x squared minus 32. And that is given. Okay, now what do we see? Okay, I see that these two angles are the same. Right here, right? And I also see that these two angles are the same. Right here and right here. So since we have two sets of angles which are the same, we know that this third angle is also congruent by the third angle's theorem. So we can say that angle P is congruent to angle T by the third angle's theorem. Okay, and then we're just going to substitute those values in, but we have to change the format, right? So we're going to say measure of angle P equals measure of angle T. Y, definition of congruent angles. All right. And then we just substitute, right? So measure of angle P is 2x squared equals measure of angle T, 4x squared minus 32. Substitution. Okay, now we just want to get x by itself. So I usually move this smaller. However, this x squared is already on this side of the equation by itself, so I'm going to move this one over here. So subtraction property of equality is happening. Okay, what are we left with? 2x squared minus 4x squared would be a negative 2x squared. That cancels. We're left with negative 32. That's just simplifying. And then we need to get the x by itself, so we have to divide both sides by negative 2. Division, property of equality. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 times x squared is just x squared. A negative divided by a negative is positive. 32 divided by 2 is 16. So simplify. Okay, and at this point, this is where we try to figure out what x is. But wait, if you look here, angle P is in terms of x squared, and angle T is in terms of x squared. So we can just leave it in terms of x squared. So let's go ahead and we'll say measure of angle P equals 2x squared, right? That is given. And then we're just going to substitute 16 in for x squared because that's what x squared equals. Okay, that is substitution. And we end up with, what do we end up with? Measure of angle P equals 2 times 16 is 32. So that is simplifying. And then we know from up here that those two things are equal. So if you take this right here, this statement here, and this statement here, we can say that the measure of angle T is also equal to 32, and that's that transitive property of equality. All right, if you got all of that right, yokonikimashita, you did a wonderful job, and I'll see you in a little bit for the next lesson.